Welcome to this Considered Opinions podcast.
I'm Dougal.
And I'm Celia. Thank you for joining us. Recently, I've been reading quite a lot of diaries. I am really enjoying them because I find them a fascinating insight into the reality of life during a particular time period and people's thought processes and experiences. And I've also been reading a history of diary keeping. So today I'd like to look at diaries and their value and how we might use that today.
So who would be some of the famous diarists?
I think the most famous diarist in the English-speaking world is probably Samuel Pepys.
Samuel Pepys.
He was writing in the 17th century and his diaries are full of hilarious anecdotes, insights into his everyday reality and life, and they give us a really good picture of what it was like to live in London at that time. Another famous diarist is Anne Frank.
Oh yes, that's a very famous one, isn't it?
And I've just finished reading a diary by Hermione, the Countess of Ranfurly. Her diaries during the Second World War. And that has been an enormous pleasure. And
not just to you either. I mean, you've read out quite a bit of it and it's hilarious.
And it is hilarious, but it's also so fascinating.
Yes.
And you really get to see history from a different perspective.
Quite a contrast, I would say, to someone like an Anne Frank or a soldier's diary. Like I've got my grandfather's diary as well, and that's a fascinating read. But that's fascinating personally for me as well because it gives the family history, and there's a bit of family culture transmitted through having, my grandfather writing that diary, and now it's a resource that I have.
And knowing what he experienced,
yes.
Stuff that he didn't necessarily talk about to his grandson, but you can still understand something more about your grandfather. I actually find those two diaries an interesting contrast because they're both writing about the North Africa campaign from different perspectives. And yet those two diaries are still very different from the official history narrative.
Yes.
So diarying has a lot of value, both in the here and now and for posterity.
Now, tell me a little bit about mass obs, because this is one that you've told me about in the past, and I find this a fascinating project.
So mass obs is short for mass observation, and it was a project that was run in the UK from about 1937 to about 1950, and they got people to write in regularly with their experiences. They did actually send out surveys.
Yep.
It was a mass obs survey. And then during the Second World War, they got people to keep diaries. And so you will get the diary of a 49-year-old housewife, and you can read what the war was like for her.
Yes.
And how she experienced it personally.
And that would have been very different to a Hermione Ranfurly.
Exactly.
Or a soldier in the front line or a sailor in the North Atlantic.
And each one has such value, and by reading them all, we get a much fuller picture of what life was like at that particular time period.
It's one of the problems with sort of the old-fashioned way of doing history. I think you've called it in the past the great man history, as opposed to the view from the people.
Because the great man history, it does have value and it has its place. But if you solely have that, it does play into this whole, I think, celebrity culture that we have, that people feel like they have to be famous to have a value or to have a voice.
Yes.
And so reading these first-hand accounts helps us to really value the experience of the ordinary everyday person as well as the great man history.
Yes.
And diaries also fall into the first-hand account classification.
So you're actually participating in history, in the recording of history.
Absolutely. And it's good historical method to go to first-hand accounts as much as you possibly can. The advantage as well for the student of history is that they're not reading a distilled history through a particular person's viewpoint. They are actually accessing these primary sources and understanding it themselves.
And if you have that filtered through one person's viewpoint, that's where you get the distortions and the propaganda creeping in. Whereas if you have multiple voices, then you're going to get a much clearer picture of what's actually going on.
Yes. And diaries are hugely accessible primary sources. And that's a wonderful place to start if you want to learn about a time period.
Okay, so what about the benefits of diarying? Why diary?
Well, diary keeping has benefits for posterity. So you're recording the history. You get to have a say. There's that old phrase, the victors get to write the history. But with keeping a diary, you are actually able to write part of the history and to counterbalance maybe what might be the official narrative. There's a wonderful example of this for the past 4 years. Somebody has written a diary throughout the COVID years, and it's online.
Yep.
It's a wonderful resource that tells the true story of what happened during that time and what people were thinking, boots on the ground kind of experience.
What's it called?
It's called The Absurd Narrative, and you can find it at www.theabsurdnarrative.co.nz. And it's a very moving read, but also I think it's a hugely important historical repository. And it actually says at the beginning that it's written for the grandchildren.
Right.
So that when people say what happened, the future generations will know that this is part of the real story that went on.
Yes. Well, another, you mentioned that quote before about history written by the victors, but here's a counter to that. The pen is mightier than the sword. So here's people's chance to redress the balance in some way. Perhaps.
Absolutely. I think particularly in this information age with all the propaganda that's out there, actually telling, and it's not necessarily writing rebuttals, it's more a case of telling and recording your own story and experiences. That has value in and of itself without any ulterior motive than that.
Would it not also be a help in seeing through some of the lies that not just that the mainstream media tell us, but that we tell ourselves, or it may help to break through bubbles and you see how other people, because it's not just about what you're writing, it's also about what you're reading. If you're reading diaries, you can see someone else's world.
And I think that's the wonderful thing is that C.S. Lewis actually talks about this, and it's a case of, you too, I thought it was just me.
Yeah. Gosh, how many times have I heard that recently?
And that's hugely comforting to us as human beings when we feel isolated and we read that other people are feeling the same thing as we are, or we have, then that's a hugely encouraging thing. The other benefit of diary keeping is Jordan Peterson calls it self-authoring. He's discovered that people actually do better when they self-author. His students are more successful when they record their experiences. But writing,
when you say record, is that writing or just audio? Are they both the same, or is one better than the other?
Funnily enough, writing actually makes a difference. I think because of the time it takes us to write, it causes a processing to happen in our brains, and so we actually end up through the diary or the writing of our experience, we are able to process it. And then also when we look back, we can see how far we've come. If we're working through something in particular, we can see how far we've come.
Right.
One of the diaries that I read about, she writes in the 18th century, and she says, "You will not judge me. I can write and I can tell you how I feel, but you're going to be the best correspondent because you're not going to judge me."
Right.
So
yes.
that's part of this. Writing helps us to deal with things and to process things and to move forward.
So how would people get started on diarying? What's the path forward here?
There's a wonderful way to diary is to just write a few lines a day. And you can get books that cover 5 years and you write a few lines a day.
So cover 5 years, so they got, 1,500 pages, or how's...
One page every day of the year has 5.
Right, so you
spaces.
can actually go back in that book and you can read 5 years of that day in one go.
In one go, all on one page. And it is actually quite fascinating to how quickly you forget and how much your life changes incrementally, even in 5 years' time. And it's a very comfortable change, and it's very reassuring to think actually life is changing all the time. We don't need to be afraid of change.
I'm reminded of a TV show in my younger years, Doogie Howser, and it would always start, the TV program, each episode would start with Doogie Howser typing just a very short line into his computer as a diary. So there's...
It's just a...
And what I guess one of the key things there is it was just short. It doesn't have to be a big tome. Sometimes less is more.
It's absolutely. And making it doable, something that you're going to keep up with, is the most important part. The nice thing as well is with the story, looking back at how far we've come, is that we get a sense of our story, and we can read other diaries and we get our direct ancestor stories, or even our national story. And that gives us a huge sense of belonging.
Yes.
And a sense of enfranchisement. We are part of this. We're part of this history, and we have a role to play now going forward because we're going to be part of somebody else's history.
It's interesting that you use that word, enfranchisement, because you would usually associate that word with democracy. So is there an element here of diarying being a democratization of history?
Well, I think diary keeping it's a great leveler, because if anybody can do it, and it automatically recognizes that every human life has value and everybody has a story.
So there's something very egalitarian about this, actually.
There is, and it can be, that's a wonderful thing about it. Only takes a 50-cent notebook and a 75-cent pen, and you can keep your diary. There's a story about a diary that was discovered in the margins and end papers of French novels in a library in a house that was in one of the ghettos in Poland. And this teenage boy is writing his diary in the margins of this book to hide it from the Germans.
Wow.
So diary and record keeping and journaling can happen in all sorts of variety of ways. The important thing is this keeping that, writing it, and then possibly having it to share.
All right then. So where to from now? What?
Well, we've got an exciting project to share with you. We would like to encourage you, our listeners, to start writing your own stories. So with this in mind, we will soon be launching the Pepys project. That's named after the famous diarist Samuel Pepys, P-E-P-Y-S. It will be a website where you can submit daily or weekly entries, recording your life and experiences for others to read. If you would like to be part of this, you can pre-register by emailing inbox@thepepsproject.com. Please date your entries and submit a username request for your Pepys Project account. We believe everyone has a story worth telling, and we would love to see a daily record told by the people for the people. Your voice, your words.
Thank you for joining us for this Considered Opinions podcast. We look forward to seeing you again next time, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.